Hello, everyone, and welcome to Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition, the show where we take you back to the good old days. Just probably not in exactly the way that you would expect from our title. I am Clayton Becker, as always.
And I am Megan Cox, still and forever.
And today, Megan, what are we going to talk about?
Today, we are rejecting car dependency and embracing multimodal transportation.
All right, so that was a mouthful.
Yes, it was. Who wrote this title?
I wonder who wrote this title. Might have been me. Possibly, maybe. With that, potentially me having written the title in mind, I want to just make it clear up at the top here that this is like one of my sort of pet topics, and I will be almost certainly incapable of not monologuing at you for a little while. So I will be relying on Megan to stop me from doing it, and to bring in her own unique perspective on this issue.
I'm still here. He still respects me. We're good.
Gender dynamics notwithstanding, yes, all of this is accurate. There's like genuinely so much that we could say about car dependency. Because cars are they're just bad for us. Like, they're just bad for us. I'm sorry. Like, pick a topic. Like, driving is routinely rated in studies as perhaps the most stressful way to commute, and they're also the most dangerous way to commute. The passenger death rate per we measure this in what's called passenger miles to sort of control for the fact that more people drive cars than take other forms of transportation. The death rate for cars is more than 50 times higher than it is for buses, 17 times higher than it is for trains, and 1,000 times higher than it is for scheduled airlines, which I will die on this hill that air travel is a form of public transportation. Anyway, sort of irrelevant. The long story short is that cars are bad for us. I could hold forth for many more minutes on all of the various ways that cars are bad for us. They contribute to air pollution, water pollution, noise pollution, all of these things. A 2020 report from the Pew Research Center, for instance, found that 78% of all microplastics in the ocean come from dust as a result of tire wear. The tires break down and they turn into microplastics, and almost all of this is from cars. And we're doing all of this. We're doing all of these problems for a small group of suburban commuters, basically. People who use freeways regularly, who drive long distances, and who, by and large, are wealthier than the average person. The Bureau of Transportation Statistics, for instance, estimates that the average annual cost of new car ownership for 2023 was over $12,000 a year. That's not something that we should be requiring people to spend money on. Anyway, I know that I've been a little bit scattered, a little bit holding forth on the problems of cars.
Excited.
I just hate them so much. The thing is, we have oriented our entire lives around cars in a way that just doesn't exist in lots of other parts of the world. And this is a point where I think is a good point for me to stop monologuing and bring Megan in. Megan has lived all over the world, lots of different places.
Many different places.
And this situation of like abject car dependency really is almost like unique to North America. So Megan, why don't you give us a couple of examples of places you've lived where this has not been the case?
Sure. So I lived in London, the UK, which famously, much like cities like New York City or Paris is another example, where they are trying to kind of rein back the use of cars, but also have extensive public transportation networks that are used by everyone. And I think this is one of the big distinctions. I don't want to jump ahead too much. One of the big distinctions between car-dependent cities or areas and transit-dependent cities or areas is when you are creating a nice infrastructure, when everyone uses the infrastructure, it winds up being a little bit nicer, a little bit better policed, and not, I don't just mean that in terms of like secure and crime free, but policed in terms of cleaner and better maintained. Washington, D.C. is another good example of this, where everyone is using the metro to get around. It feels a little bit different than in a city where transit is an afterthought. I would compare the DC Metro to the Los Angeles light rail system, where you routinely feel less safe, I would say, on the system in LA. A friend of mine in LA commuted using the light rail to work, and she said there is something happens every day on the light rail. There's something that it makes me feel uncomfortable, makes me feel scared. And that was not something I had in 2 years of living in DC, I had one instance of that on the metro. So you're just treating your system a little bit differently, I think, when everyone is using it. It's more of an indicator of wealth and status or lack thereof for people in a car-dependent area to be taking public transit, and it is treated as if it is something that the lower socioeconomic folks are using and not everyone is using.
Yeah, and to this point, most cities in the United States are not New York and DC.
That's true.
Most cities in the United States are just completely and utterly dependent on cars.
Yes.
There are only 7 counties in the entirety of the continental United States where the most common method of getting to work, the most common commute, is not in a car. 5 of these counties, are the boroughs of New York City. And one is DC, and one is a tiny, tiny county in Colorado where the way that most people are getting to work is walking.
Is it Broomfield, Colorado?
I'm not sure. I wrote these notes so long ago, Megan. Could be that place in Colorado.
Now I gotta Google it. Now I gotta look it up.
And the second most common type of commute in every one of these other counties, carpooling. So even if people are not driving their car, they are going somewhere else. They're going with someone else. Sorry.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
In most counties, more people work from home than take public transportation as their primary commuting method. All of this is a bit of a long-winded way of saying that we have oriented quite literally all of our infrastructure around cars and their drivers as sort of our primary mode of transportation, and made our infrastructure, as Megan was mentioning a little bit ago, almost actively hostile to everyone who is on foot, on a bike, or using public transportation.
Mm-hmm.
Megan has a bunch of other stories she could tell you about how basically every day that she would show up at UCLA, she would have a story of, well, here's how I nearly got murdered on my way to campus today.
Yes, I chose to ride a bike as my primary mode of transportation in Los Angeles.
Because she's crazy.
I thought it would be fine, and I thought parking on campus was too expensive. And as Clayton has said, by the time I was no longer making that commute, I had a story about just about every intersection on my route, because there are not all bike infrastructure is created equal. And there are some, I will say half-assed. There are some half-assed measures that look to sort of bring bicyclists into the transportation network, but either are not doing so in a way that protects cyclists, which disincentivizes cycling, obviously, or you are not educating motorists. The number of times I got honked or hollered at because I was on a Sharrow, where a bike can take the whole lane, and people were very mad that I was indeed taking the whole lane and they couldn't just pass right next to me. Frequent. It was a lot of time.
Yeah. Another good example of this is if you ever go to like a large strip mall in basically any American city or American suburb, you will notice that most of the shops are connected to each other by like little walkways. There's usually some sort of overhang to keep people out of like rain or snow or sleet or whatever, right? But in almost none of those parking lots will those shops be connected to the sidewalk by any sort of pedestrian path. The assumption implicit here is that everyone is arriving to these strip malls in a vehicle and is walking from their car to the shops, and that all of these stores, the only reason you might want to go between them is if you were already in one of them. Just completely and utterly ignoring the fact that in lots of places, especially in larger cities where fewer people own vehicles, lots of people are arriving on foot, and they have to walk like a quarter mile through these large parking lots from the sidewalk to the street itself. We have made everything about our transportation infrastructure specifically to cater to cars, even though cars are bad for us. They're expensive. They cause all of these environmental hazards and pedestrian fatalities, and they take up a whole bunch of land, right? To give you, I guess, a bit of a contextualization here, the last time that anyone bothered to count, there were 18.6 million parking spots in Los Angeles County. Megan, just off the top of your head, approximately how many cars do you think there are registered in Los Angeles County?
Too many.
Or I suppose, let me ask.
Guessing how many marbles are in the jar.
So I guess maybe it will be easier. How many parking spots per car do you think there are in Los Angeles County?
Well, I think it would be more than one, just never where you want them to be. Because I think parking minimums make it so that it's like there's always at least 2 spots per car, the spot at your house and the spot where you're going.
Yeah, so it is higher than 1.
It's higher than 1. It's higher than 2.
It's higher than 2. It's higher than 3. There are 3.3 parking spots for every single registered vehicle in the county. And yet, as you said, they're never where you want them, right? Like at a certain point, this just becomes a question of geometry. Like cars take up too much space.
This may be an Angelino thing, but like,
no,
researching the parking situation before you go to something is critical.
100% a thing. Every time, like, there will be times when friends invite me to things, and I'm like, I don't particularly want to go because I know that I'm going to have to find parking and it's going to be a nightmare.
Yeah.
But to contextualize this even further, approximately 14% of all incorporated land in Los Angeles County is parking spots.
You say 14%?
14%. Nearly 1.5 times the amount of space that roads take up in the county. And yet it is still impossible to find parking. Like, cars take up too much space. It is simply a question of...
The cars are too damn big?
It is simply a question of geometry at some point. God. I know we've talked at this point a little bit about the problems of cars and all of this, but many people might argue that, well, the solution is to just devote more space to cars, right? We need to widen roads. We need to increase the number of parking spaces. We need to build parking garages, so on and so forth. And what I'm hopefully convincing you of here is that this is not possible. Right? This will not work.
Are we out of space at a certain point?
At a certain point, we run out of space. Like,
well, I mean, and I would suggest this, especially as an issue. I know we keep talking about LA. I'll bring this up in terms of Portland too. If you have a geographic area surrounded by hills, you don't have a ton of places to put the roads or to make them wider. You're kind of constrained.
And like, shockingly, lots of places are geographically constrained in this way. Boston, New York City, Seattle, right? Seattle's between Puget Sound and I think it's like Lake Washington, right?
Lake Washington, Lake Union.
Yeah,
there's
right?
a bunch of lakes.
There's a bunch of these geographic constraints that face many cities. San Francisco and the Bay Area, right? Like you can't just build parking out onto the water. It just won't work, right? And there are places
in... We need parking barges? Is that what we're going to do now?
There are places in the United States where maybe you could argue, that, well, it's a flat enough plain, there's not enough geographic features where we'll eventually run out of space. North Carolina, Atlanta,
Oklahoma City supremacy.
Oklahoma, like the Texas.
I want to be clear, I enjoyed Oklahoma City. It's lovely. But
the Texas Triangle, right? All of these different places, right? But then you run into another problem, which is that eventually you reach people's sort of natural tolerance for commuting distance, which is about roughly an hour a day, more or less. Sure, there are people who are willing to do a commute that's longer than that. I myself frequently end up commuting more than an hour a day on the bus to and from UCLA. But most people's commuting tolerance is about an hour. And so at a certain point, you get so far away from Houston, you get so far away from Dallas, you get so far away from Los Angeles, Portland, Seattle, all of these cities that it is no longer practical. Even if there is space on the roads and space for your cars once you arrive, it is no longer practical for you to be driving into the city as a commute. And this is where cars and car dependency link to the current housing crisis that we are experiencing, which is that large cities have essentially stopped building housing. We'll have a full episode on this at some point, but the long story short is that our biggest metro areas, our most in-demand metro areas, places like New York and Seattle and all of the cities that I've mentioned thus far, build very, very little housing relative to the size of their population. And for a long time, they used suburbs as a release valve, basically. I'm sure, Megan, you've mentioned in previous episodes growing up in a smaller town away from Portland. I'm sure you saw as you got older.
Oh my gosh, yes, absolutely. This is very much the story of the small town that I grew up in. For those of you who know the Portland metro area, Happy Valley used to actually be in a valley. It was a physically, geographically contained space that expanded into Clackamas County like an amoeba. And it's wild. It is genuinely wild to drive through it now. And places that were pasture are housing developments now. And it is maybe 45 minutes outside of Portland, like the Portland downtown area. I think about every once in a while the fact that my dad would commute from Happy Valley to Hillsborough every day, as would my mother commute from Happy Valley to the West Hills. And those are drives that would probably take you 2 hours each way today.
Yeah. Another thing, even when we talk about cars, is that eventually your commutes get longer because everybody else is already also taking the freeway.
There are no times in the Portland metro area right now, and this is my experience in LA as well, there is no time that is not rush hour.
Yeah. I remember I went, I was born in Portland. I lived there for the first 8 years of my life, and I went back for the first time as a junior in high school when I was taking a tour of colleges that I might want to attend, right? And I was taken aback by just how much worse the traffic was between 8 and 17, right? Just that 9 years, bonkers. The traffic in Portland got way, way worse, right? Yeah. And this is sort of the dual problem here, which is one, just one more lane, bro, doesn't work. You can't expand roads enough to the point where there will not be traffic on them, right? Texas is trying, and it is not working, right?
No, because it's not the lane, it's the getting on and off of the freeway seems to be the problem.
If you are dumping the same number of cars onto the same size surface streets, it does not matter how wide you make the freeway. And also, we have a good amount of research on what's called induced demand, that when you add more lanes, more people choose to drive, or they choose not to carpool. They choose to their bosses tell them that they no longer can work from home because the commute should be less problematic, and that just makes people fill back up the space. But back to the earlier point that I was making about the release valve of the suburbs. We've reached the point after 30 miles of contiguous suburbs around all of these major metro areas, where those housing markets are no longer serving as a release valve for the cities that they belong to. And so housing prices in major cities are no longer able to not increase like crazy, because people who could move to the city, who want to move to the city, can just move to the suburbs instead and commute into downtown, right? Or commute into wherever their job happens to be. That just doesn't work anymore. The 30 miles of suburbs between downtown Los Angeles and San Bernardino, or between downtown Los Angeles and North County, San Diego through Orange County, they're no longer working as this kind of release valve. But the problem is that nobody can move to the cities themselves without paying an arm and a leg, because the space that we need for cars is preventing us from building more housing. So it's all just this one big vicious cycle of cars make things more expensive and more spread out. Therefore, we need more space for cars. Therefore, things get more expensive. And over time, nothing works about it anymore, and the whole thing starts to break down. And that is essentially where we find ourselves on this grayish Tuesday in November of 2024, a situation where we are doubling down on this ineffective transportation strategy of trying to make cars work in a way that they do not work for fundamental questions of geometry. I realize I have monologued at you so much over the last 20 minutes. Why don't we take a break? We'll come back and we'll talk about how embracing multimodal transportation can help us get out of this car dependency that we're facing.
Well, welcome back, everyone. When you left us and we left you, Clayton was just telling us about how cars are terrible and math is the real enemy here. I think that was about where we were.
Yes, well, a specific type of math, geometry, basically. Cars take up too much space. You can't force them into a smaller volume than the one that they occupy. But yeah, so the basic conceit of this episode, obviously, is that cars are bad, but that doesn't actually tell you why we ought to embrace multimodal transportation, right?
We could just embrace defeat and despair.
Or, well, it doesn't. There are lots of people who won't be convinced by the preceding arguments, shall I say.
Sure. Yeah. It's just because I almost get killed by cars all the time. This is just a me problem, not an everybody problem.
And there's a reasonable extent to the arguments here, right? Like, there are places in which taking public transportation is not particularly pleasant, right? Yeah. And like, I'll be the first to admit, sometimes like I'll be trying to come home from like the bar trivia night that a bunch of us do, and I'll be trying to take the bus up from the E line here in Los Angeles, and I'll be waiting for 25 minutes for a bus at 8 p.m.
Yep.
Not a usable transportation system, right?
Nope.
Not particularly useful, not particularly usable. And yet, I think that it is important to understand that the only reason that our cities are not completely hobbled, like 100% gridlocked, is because of the release valve that public transportation provides. You'll often hear people talk about, in opposition to the arguments that I made earlier in the video and that I'm about to make here, that cities with robust transit often have longer commute times. This is true in New York. It's true in London. It's true in Paris. It's true in lots of parts of the developing world as well. Places that have more built out transportation networks often have longer commutes. And they'll point to this fact as evidence, basically, that transit doesn't work and it's not worth investing in. However, oh, sorry. Yeah, Megan, I saw a thought there.
I did. A thought is percolating that it's not the same. Driving a car for an hour and taking a train for an hour aren't the same thing.
Well, they aren't the same thing. It's true. I find I used to take the train down to San Diego a couple of times a month, or like once every month for the job that I was working before I began this program. And that 3 hours was far more enjoyable on the Pacific Surfliner than driving down from Los Angeles to San Diego was. But I think that even with like acknowledging that difference, right? Mm-hmm. It's still the case that the claims of transit making commutes longer, or that transit doesn't work to alleviate commutes, is getting the direction of causality backwards here.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Cities with the best public transportation have it because they need transit in order to move that volume of people, right?
I can't imagine trying to take a car from the end of the line on the London Tube into downtown Central Business District bank station kind of area. I can't imagine that. That would take you 5 hours.
Yeah, and like imagine then literally everybody doing that, right? Yeah. Like imagine that. I want you to imagine like the London Underground doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. The New York City Metro doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. The Los Angeles Metro even doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. That's the relevant counterfactual here. That is the relevant like alternative state of the world that we need to consider for ourselves.
Yes.
You have to ask yourself, what would happen if the hundreds of thousands, the millions of people who take public transit every day would be doing if they weren't taking public transportation? They wouldn't simply vanish, right? They wouldn't be working from home. Mm-hmm. They'd be contributing to congestion, basically all being in cars, right? Even if you imagine that these people double up, triple up, quadruple up in carpooling arrangements, right? That's still hundreds of thousands of additional cars on the road every single day. And like, you think Los Angeles traffic is bad now? You think Chicago traffic is bad now? Imagine what it would be like if people were not able to take the LA Metro, Metrolink, Metro trains, the L in Chicago, like the New York City Metro. Just imagine how awful that this would be. Yes. Megan, I have a question for you to sort of illustrate my point here. Los Angeles is known as a pretty car dependent city, right? Yes. I don't think that this is a secret to anyone, least of all people who are listening to this podcast. If you were to guess, combining the bus systems and the rail systems, both the light rail and the heavy rail, that the LA Metro has, approximately how many on an average weekday, what is the estimated ridership of the Los Angeles Metro system?
Oh my God, I would have no way of even, I mean, I'm guessing like 500,000 people. Am I like off by a decimal point? Like,
so I'll tell you the answer in a bit.
Yeah.
I want to go through this. What makes you say 500,000? Just sort of work through this with me and with the audience.
Well, so going from, cause you already told me like about how many cars there are in Los Angeles. And it's what, like it's, and it just seems like so few people are on, so many cars are there relative to the number of people I know live in Los Angeles. So I'm kind of working backwards from,
okay.
But I think I'm going to be underestimating it just on the basis of the population of Los Angeles. which is what, like 4-6 million?
So Los Angeles itself, the city proper, is just under 4 million people.
Okay.
The county is more like 10 million people.
Okay.
Just under 10 million.
Okay.
You have underestimated it a little bit here.
Okay.
I'm sorry to ask you to keep guessing, but how much do you think you underballed you lowballed the estimate by?
Well, we're gonna keep using the phrase underballed now. I'm really happy
yeah. How much do you think you lowballed that estimate by?
Oh my gosh, I didn't even know. I was told there would be no math.
I made no such promises.
That's valid. That's valid. Okay, I think I'm off by 250,000. I think I'm going to bump it up to 750.
Okay, so your initial estimate was around 500,000, around 500,000.
Mm-hmm.
I want you to take that ridership and double it.
It's a million?
In October 2024,
okay.
The most recent data we have, because they release this periodically, they release it month by month. The average estimated ridership on a weekday for the LA Metro was 1,025,262 people on an average weekday.
So Clayton, I want to stop you right here. You're telling me that a quarter of the people in the city proper are not driving and are taking the metro.
There are likely people who do not live in the city proper who are taking LA's public transportation.
Okay, and it's still, traffic is still the train wreck that it is?
Yes, that is what I am telling you. Okay. I am telling you that there's
nowhere to put enough overpasses to fix that. depending
on what the proper denominator is here, whether it is the number of people in the city proper, the number of people in the county, the number of people in the metro area, somewhere between 5 and 25% of all people who are commuting in Los Angeles are commuting using the metro system.
Okay.
My intuition is that the 10%, the 5 to 10% is probably the correct denominator to use here. Because there are lots of people who commute into Los Angeles from Orange County. There are lots of people who commute into Orange County from Los Angeles County, right? And vice versa. And a smaller number of people who commute in San Bernardino and Riverside counties to all of these different places, right? But the basic point here is that 1 million people on an average weekday are taking public transportation and therefore are not clogging up roads in Los Angeles. The freeways, the cities, like city roads, like toll roads in Orange County and all that. 1 million people who at minimum, we might say, would fill 250,000 additional cars a day if they were to quadruple up carpooling. And the traffic in Los Angeles is still this bad. That is the extent to which cars cannot solve this problem. I can see on your face that, like, again, for those who are not watching this, podcasting, notably not a visual medium, there's a little bit of dumbfounding little bit of dumbfounded that's going on here.
Yes, because any time that I have taken the public transit system in Los Angeles, it has not struck me as the public transit system of the second city of an advanced industrial democracy. Really, shall we say?
Really laying it on there.
You know, like I have taken, not to toot my own horn here, I've used the public transit system in London, in Amsterdam, and the Netherlands more broadly, the Copenhagen area up into Sweden. Man,
they're going to come at you for saying Copenhagen, trying to be, what elitism is this?
I don't know, man. Singapore, my God, like directions on the floor to tell you not to block the doors when people are exiting. Platonic ideal of public transit. Yeah, you have systems that seem like they are designed as the first thought, not as an afterthought.
And And so now just imagine this is like the LA metro system keeps the city from being totally choked. Like if you think
all we get is the sombrita.
Yeah, if you think that like think about how bad you think traffic is in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. Now imagine it with 250,000 to a million more cars on the road during rush hour.
Been nicer to the poor R12. It was trying so hard.
Actually, so Megan, what Megan is referencing there is the Rapid 12, which is a bus run by Santa Monica's bus service.
Yes.
Those numbers not included in what I just told you.
Okay,
not Santa Monica.
Talk about the stupid fragmentation of the transit system.
We'll do a whole other episode on that.
Okay.
Reject fragmentation, embrace consolidation, or something like that. I don't know.
Okay.
But the long story short, the point that I'm trying to make here through this long example of LA's transportation system is imagine cities that actually have robust transportation systems. New York, London, Santiago, Singapore, Tokyo, Copenhagen, Prague, Paris, Madrid, Barcelona, Lisbon, all of these places. Imagine them without those public transportation systems and imagine how quickly they become just completely and utterly choked by cars, completely and utterly incapable of getting people around the city. This is the fundamental point that I want to make about embracing multimodal transportation. It is our only option. There is no sense, no way in which you could solve this problem through private vehicles, even self-driving cars, with all of the space savings they might take up, their ability to be on the road more often, the fact that people don't have to drive them, all of the projections and promises that people are making about self-driving cars. They do not solve the fundamental geometry problem. The fact that you can move 1 million people more effectively in trains and buses than you can in private vehicles. This is the end game. This is it, right? Like there is no other option. And so with that pronouncement that I'm going to make here, let's talk about actually getting ourselves away from car dependency.
Yeah. What are we going to do here? Because I mean, at least in the case of Portland is an example where they ripped out the streetcar lines in the mid-century and they are putting them back exactly where they were. And that's annoying. But
shocking that the ideas we had in the past were better than what we're doing today.
Almost
someone should make a podcast about it.
The conceit of the podcast. Oh God. Okay. Yeah. What do we do? This is going to be expensive but necessary, I imagine you're going to tell me?
Yes. So the basic idea here is that getting ourselves away from car dependency is not going to be easy, right? Mm-hmm. Our built environment is just that. It's built, right? Having to put back streetcar lines exactly where they were torn out is expensive. It takes a lot of time, money, and effort. But you're going to need to build a new built environment, right? That's just, it's the expensive. It's them's the breaks, right? Like, I don't know how else to put it.
Or we keep doing the same thing and it's shitty.
Yeah, basically. The other thing that I want to point out here, though, is that it's not really possible to run the sort of robust public transportation services that exist in like great cities around the world: New York, Paris, Tokyo, Singapore, all the ones that we've mentioned, in the kind of low density environments that the United States prioritizes for its cities, right? Mm-hmm. So part of this is going to be, again, as we linked cars to housing, we'll now have to link housing to transportation. Building the built environment, building infill development, new multifamily housing in such a way that the density can actually support robust public transportation so that people will actually take it, right? Mm-hmm. However, in the meantime, we need to focus on types of transportation that can exist in our current built environment. And for me, this means two key things in particular. First, it means improving bus services, and in particular, creating what are called priority bus lanes, or in some places, you might see these called bus rapid transit,
Mhm.
where buses don't actually have to sit in traffic themselves. The buses can just have their own lane, and they go past traffic that's at a standstill.
Mhm.
This marks almost every successful bus system everywhere in the world.
Mhm.
To bring in another international example, I went to Mexico City on my honeymoon over the last summer, and there are these priority bus lanes, bus rapid transit, all over Mexico City. Much completer streets, at least in the center of Mexico City, than there are in most American cities. So this does a bunch of good things for buses. It improves bus services. It's quicker and easier to deploy than rail service, even if it can't move as many people at once. It protects buses from rogue drivers, right? And it makes taking the bus a faster mode of transportation rather than a slower mode of transportation.
The bus at that point, just to make this like practical for folks, if you have tried to take a bus and looked at a bus table or a bus schedule and thought you knew when the bus was coming and then stood there and waited for the bus because it didn't show up when you thought, it's because, oh, the bus is late because the bus is in traffic.
It's because the bus is stuck behind a bunch of cars. Yeah.
The bus is coming when it's supposed to be coming, which means for me, one of the things that was a time sink when taking the bus was, oh, you want to be out at the stop maybe 10 minutes beforehand to make sure that you catch the bus that you think you're going to catch. This takes that out of the equation. This is much more efficient for riders.
And it also allows bus service to be much more frequent.
Yes.
If buses don't have to worry about sitting in traffic, the same bus will complete a route much faster, right? And so it allows for more frequent and more reliable bus service.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the main thing that I think lots of our cities can do, at least in the immediate term, right? I love the fact that Los Angeles is building out more of its light rail and heavy rail infrastructure. I think that that's a great long-term thing for the city to be doing, right? Come 2040, 2050, the fact that we have those rail lines is going to be really important once we get more of this infill development. But in the meantime, with the physical infrastructure that we have, with the surface streets that we have, expanding bus rapid transit is going to be one of those very important things. And then the second thing is improving bike infrastructure. This is, I know, going to be Megan's jam as our bike commuter.
My song.
But most of the best transit cities around the world have good bike infrastructure. Infrastructure that is, like, quite frankly, as much of a regular sort of forethought for planners as how they're going to get cars around. They think of how they're going to get bikes around. This is in the Netherlands. This is in Mexico City. They also have very good bike lanes in the center of the city. It's in Paris. It's in New York. They're building out a large scale bike network. Portland as well, where Megan lives now, has a good number of what are called greenways.
Yes, absolutely. There is a street next to me where there is some sort of preventative, like physical, like not quite a Jersey barrier, but something a little bit smaller to prevent cars from using it as a through street about every 3 blocks. So bikes can pass through it or around it, but cars have to go around to really, and that was the only thing that really changed about the road in terms of installing that infrastructure and making that change. A point that I do want to make on this, especially when you compare biking as a mode of transit in some place like the Netherlands versus the United States, when you see people biking in the Netherlands, there is an entirely different style of bicycle, the Dutch bike. You're sitting up, and many Dutch folks don't wear bike helmets. And you would look at that as an American. My dad was in a bicycle accident when I was a teenager, and so my parents are like helmet evangelists. They're very, very dedicated to this. And you would look at that and say, well, you people use these bikes all the time, but you're not being sufficiently safe. The risks are so much smaller in intentionally created infrastructure that keeps bicyclists separate from other kinds of vehicles.
Yeah, and let's be like perfectly clear about this, right? Like the physical barriers are part of what makes this work. Like,
yes.
Paint and signage
doesn't work.
Paint is not infrastructure. Right?
I want to tell you, like my biggest I almost got killed moment was when I was in a marked bike lane, paint marked, but no physical barrier whatsoever, and I had somebody merge across the lane because they were trying to make a right turn. and they just about came right into me. So paint is not a barrier.
It's not a barrier. It's not infrastructure. It's not protection. And the rules that say that cars can't park in the bike lane or that they can't, merge in a certain way are just not worth the paper that they're printed on. Or I guess in this case, not worth the aluminum signage that they are printed on.
Yeah.
And so these are the two things that I think we should be doing in the very, very immediate term. Los Angeles passed a proposition, Measure HLA, during the primary elections in the spring, that will force Los Angeles to adhere to its Complete Streets program. Basically what this means is it will force Los Angeles to, when they do road work, actually build the infrastructure in the way that their long-term mobility plan says that they should. And that includes things like building out bus rapid transit, includes things like building out protected bike lanes. And other cities should follow suit, right? What we need is this kind of complete street. We need more options for people to get around. And the big thing that I want to hammer home here at the end is if you are someone who drives, you should want there to be more options for people to get around. It is a better experience for you as a driver not to have to sit behind 15 other cars, because those people feel as though they can take bus rapid transit, they can take rail, they can take a bike, or they can walk, because we've built housing close enough to places where people want to go. And another point here,
too far into our housing discourse as well, but we need to create infrastructure, or we need to create a legal structure that facilitates that increased construction around transit or around planned transit. And additionally, I would suggest that as we build this sprawl, we need to be thinking about how we will adapt it for transit, or at the very least, how we'll adapt it for the cars that are going to be using it. The sprawly suburb where I lived briefly outside of Portland was connected by a road that was not designed for the amount of traffic that was on it. And it was a really significant problem in terms of both wear and tear, and just in terms of congestion. It was very narrow and windy. We should not have had nearly the number of cars on it that we do, but we do. And we have one kind of half-assed bus route back and forth. And it was definitely an afterthought, because you don't have bus pullouts. I don't know what else to call it, little side bits where the bus
little
can
turnoffs.
stop.
Little turnoffs.
You don't have that. And so continuing this path dependency that we're in, of thinking that sprawl will save us, is just making the problem worse and worse. The earlier we start to fix this problem, the sooner we get it fixed.
Yeah. And I think the critical thing here is understanding that when we say multimodal transportation, we do still include cars in that, right?
Yes. Yes.
Even in countries, even in cities with extremely well done public transportation, there are still people who drive. There are still cars.
Sometimes you need to go to IKEA.
If you've never seen, I'm sure people will have seen videos of the Shibuya intersection in Tokyo, right? There are thousands of pedestrians that cross the street while the lights are all red. And then there are cars that go through, right? Because even in Tokyo, which has perhaps the world's most expansive and accessible transit network, you still have people who are going to drive in private vehicles. And what we're trying to point out here is that can't be the only strategy. Right? It needs to be complemented by things like public transportation, pedestrianized infrastructure, bike infrastructure, so on and so forth. I think what I'll leave people with here is that only about half of car trips are over 3 miles. Very, very few car trips are actually significantly longer distance than that. Almost all of the car trips that we take are local, basically. And they're car trips that people don't need a car to take, right? Sure, some of them are to a grocery store, some of them are to IKEA, right? But others are to the movie theater, there to a bar, there to visit our friends, right? And those kinds of trips become a lot more doable to do without your car if you could just hop on a bicycle and know that it would be safe for you to get there. Or if you could just walk out your front door, go to the bus stop, and know that the bus is going to come within a couple of minutes of you showing up, right? Sure, you might still take a car in some of these instances, but you also might not, and others might not. And in the end, that multimodal transportation, getting people around in a variety of different ways, rather than just one way. Remember, only 7 counties in the entire United States don't have car commuting, sole vehicle commuting as their number one form of commuting. Getting people around in these ways just simply will be more effective than doubling down on this ineffective strategy of pursuing, as Megan said, this path dependency of continuing to be completely and utterly dependent on private vehicles, on cars.
I have nothing to add.
All right, then. Well,
you said it all.
I said it all. All right. Well, in that case, if I said it all, I have been Clayton Becker.
And I have been Megan Cox.
And until next time, remember to reject car dependency and embrace multimodal transportation.
We will see you next time.
See you guys.